Sports and politics don't mix. So say diehard fans who claim sports should be a great escape from the stress of living in a world gone mad. But the reality is we've come a long way since superstar LeBron James was told to stay away from politics and just shut up and dribble. Now, hot-button issues from gender equality to racial justice, from gun safety to voting rights, are part of the playing field. Here to help us understand how that changes the game is an all-star panel. Jerry Brewer, sports columnist for The Washington Post. Brandi Chastain, two-time World Cup winner and Olympic gold medalist. Muffet McGraw, legendary former Notre Dame women's basketball coach. And Dave Zirin, sports editor for The Nation and best-selling author of The Kaepernick Effect. We welcome you. We welcome all of our guests, our studio audience, you out there. Dave, I am going to start with you because your signature is writing about the intersection of politics and sports. And that's a dynamic as old as organized sports itself that's driven by, and these are your words, the myth of inclusion juxtaposed against the reality of exclusion. Talk about what that means.
Sure. First of all, Jane, thanks so much for having me. It's an honor to be here with some of these folks. It's an amazing panel. I often talk about the foundations of organized sports, baked into the cake of organized sports, dating back to the 19th century, is this myth of inclusion and reality of exclusion that has made the sports world political really from day one. See, when I say the myth of inclusion, I mean a lot of the rhetoric and marketing around early organized sports was saying that sports are the best reflection of the United States, where if anybody works hard enough, they can make it. And anybody who takes the playing field has the chance to achieve, just like this country as a whole. Sports are for everybody. Yet the reality, of course, is that sports were not for everybody. Women were told not to play. If you were a black or a brown person, you were told to form your own leagues or do whatever, but just don't bother the mainstream organized sports leviathan that was beginning to grow. And so from the beginning, you had this fight for access by women, by people of color, trying to find a space for themselves in the sports world. So that's the myth of inclusion, the reality of exclusion, and that's been a potent political collision since the very beginning.
So why is there this aversion to mixing politics into sports? You know, people get hostile. Let's be honest. They just, shut up and dribble. It's that mentality. How do you justify people getting out on their platform and speaking out when they're being paid to play basketball, for example?
Well, I just think that we have to understand that, if just because you're a professional athlete doesn't mean you've signed away your right to have an opinion. I also think that part of why I always try to listen to what athletes are saying is out of respect for the tremendous tradition of sports and politics. Like the civil rights movement was emboldened and enriched by the existence of people like Jackie Robinson and Althea Gibson. The 1960s were helped formed by people like Muhammad Ali and John Carlos and Tommie Smith. The women's liberation struggle without Billie Jean King would be very different in our collective memory. So you know historically that sports has had this power to reach and shape people and shape this country. And so you want to be able to see, at least I always want to see, what athletes are saying to see if they are indeed what sports sociologist Dr. Harry Edwards said, and that's he called them a weather vane and the canary in the coal mine for what's happening in this country. It always seems like what's brewing in the sports world is a decade ahead of the rest of us. So I like knowing what they're saying.
Everybody else is playing catch up. Well, I want to turn to you, Muffet, because you've spent your career trying to level an unlevel playing field. And there are a lot of feisty videos of you out there. You know, she's like, in fact, that's how you're here today, frankly, because your passion for gender equity is just unparalleled. At one point, I heard you say that women are treated as less than, almost like they're the JV team. Where do you think we are today, just in that respect?
Well, Jane, as you know, Title IX is about to turn 50. And when we started back in the 70s, 90% of all women's coaches of all women's sports were women. Now we're just 40% of those. So we're going in the wrong direction, and we need to make some strides. I think that Dave's exactly right. There is a myth of inclusion, and women, we're really suffering from that. We need to have more female coaches. We need to have more female role models. We need to step up, but it's the athletic directors doing the hiring, primarily white men, who just are not being intentional enough about who they hire.
So why has it dropped, do you think? Is it just a matter of white men doing the hiring?
I think one of the unintentional consequences of Title IX was that we started to get equality with our salaries. And so men looked and said, oh, wow, I can make a pretty good salary if I go into the women's game, because it's really hard to break into the men's game. So they've really come across into our game. And again, in the hiring process, women don't show that confidence that men do. You know, we don't have that same confidence to get up and say, I'm going to win you a national championship. We talk in we's, you know, we're collaborators. And so the AD's hiring the person that says they're going to win a national championship.
All right. Well, at this point, Brandi Chastain, I think a lot of people know you from that iconic photograph. What the New York Times said it was the most iconic photograph of a female athlete ever taken, when you ripped off your T-shirt after scoring the winning goal in the 1999 World Cup. They know that Brandi Chastain. They may not know the Brandi Chastain who back in 1996, along with the rest of her team, was allegedly making, was it $10 a day? As I think what I read, you're smiling, and being told by the men not to be greedy. So I guess the question for you is, when you heard that the women's soccer scored that landmark settlement of $24 million of pay equity, what was the first thing that shot through your mind?
Oh, I'm so grateful that I don't have to have the same conversation and hear the same question, which is, why is it that the women's team is winning World Cups and Olympic gold medals, and yet they're paid less? And so I think I let out a collective sigh to, thank goodness I don't have to answer that question any longer. But that doesn't mean that the conversation isn't over. And so I think, to Muffet's point, you know, women's sports have been elevated. Opportunity to coach has been elevated. Pay salaries have been elevated, yet we're not finding as many women being encouraged, one, trained, two, embraced, three, to be in those positions yet. And that is that's a great opportunity for us to move forward with Billie Jean King has been such an amazing role model and mentor to our women's national team, to USA hockey, and to all other women about, we have to support each other to reach our full potential. And that's in the places that we want to be, not just where others want us to participate.
All right, Jerry, you talk about the fact that sports is often seen as a balm for an ailing society. If you want an ailing society, you don't have to look very far these days. And there were polls taken last fall where people basically said they wanted to tune out anything political. They just wanted to veg out and watch sports. And yet, you've got a lot of culture war activity happening within sports parameters. How do you see the two interacting?
Well, sports is a microcosm of society. It's not separate from society. And it's interesting that so many things have happened during the pandemic where sports leagues literally tried to wall themselves off from society so that they could play games. And it was especially impactful in 2020, starting with the NBA and WNBA bubble. And you sort of saw, here they are trying to focus in to make the TV money, to be able to compete.
Right.
And what happens? You have all of these issues with police lethality. And you saw how it affected their mindsets and their hearts. And I think the problem when we become this idea of sports as escapism, yes, it is. Yes, it's entertainment. But I do think that as athletes and sports figures have grown more conscious, they're starting to realize that you can become a bit complicit in society being numb just by entertaining and only entertaining. And so they're saying, you know what, we're people. When I'm finished with this 2 hours of competition, I gotta go back out here into a society that doesn't care about me unless I'm on my field of play. And I think that they're starting to realize that we just can't show up and play and allow people to forget all of the time. And so they're just carving out a little bit of time, just a little bit of time to talk about some of these issues that are important to them for you to understand who they are when they're not in their uniform.
But there are consequences, and let me just go back to Dave. Dave, because the Kaepernick effect, Colin Kaepernick took a stand, took a knee, did something he felt his conscience dictated he should do, and he's been blackballed, he's become a pariah, he's been vilified, he's been called unpatriotic. There are people who think what he did was absolutely terrible. And Colin Kaepernick has not worked for 5 years, since what, January 1st, 2017. So what is the message that sends?
I think it's going to be a stain on the NFL for as long as people talk about sports history, that they took 5 years of somebody's prime, their prime playing career, their prime earning time in their life, because he dared to give a damn. And there are a lot of folks, not just on the NFL playing field, but in the managerial and executive ranks, who would not pass a morality test. And here is somebody who is not only passable from a moral perspective, but is actually trying to exercise a moral outlook on society and using his incredible platform to do so. And he paid this price for it. And I do believe that has a ripple effect through society, that Kaepernick effect. But the ripple effect is complicated, because one of the things that Kaepernick doing that did is that it inspired a generation of young athletes to do the same thing. And, summer of 2020, we had the largest racial justice or any kind of protests in the history of the United States. And while many roads may have led us to 2020, I'm convinced that one of those roads runs through the playing fields of the United States and the hundreds and hundreds of young athletes who took a knee because they saw Kaepernick do it and sparked discussions and controversies in their hometowns, from Lubbock, Texas to upstate New York to a ton of places in between. So there's that effect, but then there's another effect too, and that's the chilling effect. Because I've often believed that the reason why Colin Kaepernick never really found work again in the NFL was because NFL franchise owners felt like he had more value as a ghost story and as a quarterback who could lead a team to a Super Bowl. If they thought he was one of the 3 best quarterbacks in the NFL, maybe he would have gotten that job. But what they wanted more than anything else was a ghost story, was to be able to tell young players, you better not step out of line or this could be your fate.
You mentioned politics in terms of the through line, basically, going back to a story that happened that made, obviously, a lot of waves, which was the women's basketball players who took on one of the co-owners of the Atlanta Dream, Senator Kelly Loeffler at the time, because she renounced the Black Lives Matter movement. She renounced basically racial justice. And they really went after her and lobbied support for her opponent, Reverend Raphael Warnock, who subsequently won. And I mean, these women are really, Muffet, given credit for the fact that they were able to oust Kelly Loeffler. Now, is it easier when you're a team working together? In other words, you're not an individual. You're not a Muhammad Ali. You're not a Colin Kaepernick. You're not standing out. You're working together. What is the sensitivity there in terms of your political stance?
Well, and it's not just a team, because the entire WNBA does a fantastic job on their social justice platform. Every team that went to Atlanta did something. They wore T-shirts, but I think the Atlanta Dream did a fantastic job of getting out, talking to people, making their message public, using their platform. And I'm sure they're going to be doing the same for Stacey Abrams when the time comes for the next one. But, you have to look and see, this is what's right. And I think it was Martin Luther King said, it doesn't matter. You have to do what's right. And that is how you determine. It's not about what's going to happen politically or any backlash you're going to have. You just have to do what you in your heart know is right.
But then let me ask you a question from the business point of view, Jerry, because again, you've written about the women's basketball folks and their political stands extensively. They're not profitable. They're not a profitable enterprise. In fact, they've just gotten, I think it's an infusion of $70 million from investors like Condoleezza Rice and Nike and Laurene Powell Jobs to try and revamp their economic model. Now, the question becomes, are they not popular because their political stands are rubbing some people, some fans, the wrong way?
No. There is a long history in this country about just issues embracing women's athletics. I do think when you think about the business of sports as it relates to anything that causes any kind of polarity, there's always that concern of if you take too far of a stand, well, it's it's kind of like a fake line. Michael Jordan and Republicans buy sneakers too, right? You don't want politically to divide people because you're afraid you'll lose part of a fan base. I tend to think, however, that our sports obsession in America is so strong that people need to have the courage to ride out certain waves. And Colin Kaepernick taking a knee was not going to take down the NFL's business model. And anything that happens in these polarizing issues, I think you just need to stand on integrity. And I think integrity over time amplifies the loyalty that people have.
Okay. At this point, we have some footage from when Megan Rapinoe did testify before the House committee. And Brandy, I want to get your reaction on the other side of this, but this is when she testified last year during, I think it's World Equality Pay Day or something like that. And we're going to take a look at that footage, and I'll talk to you on the other side.
What we've learned and what we continue to learn is that there's no level of status and there's no accomplishment or power that will protect you from the clutches of inequality. One cannot simply outperform inequality or be excellent enough to escape discrimination of any kind. And I'm here today because I know firsthand that this is true. We're so often told in this country that if you just work hard and continue to achieve, you will be rewarded and rewarded fairly. It's the promise of the American dream, but that promise has not been for everyone.
Brandy, I want to ask you about one of your teammates from the 1999 team, Brianna Scurry. There's a documentary that's out about her life. Talks about the fact that she stood alone on the field in the sense that she was African American and she was openly gay. She suffered racism, homophobia. She suffered a horrible concussion that ended her career. And she came to the edge of suicide. Now, you were part of the documentary, but the question I have for you is, that was 23 years ago. Do you have a sense that maybe Brianna would have been treated differently in the times that we're living in now, that there would have been more tolerance, that there would have been more understanding, more inclusion?
I would like to say yes, because I believe that we as a whole global community should be more tolerant. We're more educated. We have more insight to what Megan was saying, what we were talking about today, you know, this inequality, this injustice, you know, the fact that I have always believed that sport has been a great unifier, but understand how it really excludes people at the same time. You know, I'm a friend of Bryce Scurry. I am a big believer in her as a person, and I support her. And the fact that there was a lot that we didn't know is also, I think, very much on all of us as teammates and I would say people in communities to be aware of what people are going through, be more compassionate, be more empathetic, be more engaged. And I think we are in a better place than 23 years ago, but we are clearly not out of the woods on so many of these matters. And it's devastating to know Brianna's suffering this many years later, that she wasn't her whole, full, true self all the time, or being able to feel that she could give information that was about what was going on for her, and I feel responsible for that as a teammate and a friend, and that we were, family really on our team. So this is, to the last question, you made a point. You were talking about business of sports. I think, change is uncomfortable, and for women's sports, I feel, that change has a lot of discomfort because it doesn't look like it's looked before. It doesn't sound like it sounded before, and power is maybe lost. And so I think, that's where we have the biggest amount of growing to do.
Dave, the thing that sticks with me when I listen to that Megan Rapinoe clip is you can't outperform inequality. That's if you can define what inequality is. And we're now going to turn to the whole conversation that's very uncomfortable for a lot of people about transgender athletes and the sort of, I don't know what to even call it, firestorm of controversy that's erupted. Talk about that for a minute.
Well, and what I say may not be agreed with everybody, and that's okay. I think this is an issue that we need to talk about, that we need profoundly cooler political heads in trying to figure out how to make sports expansive and inclusive for transgender athletes, particularly trans girls and women. The first thing I would say is that I think a lot of these laws that are being passed at the state level, like if you look at the one in Ohio, is not only incredibly damaging to trans girls, it's one of the laws banning trans athletes from competing in sports, trans girls from competing on women's teams. But it's also incredibly invasive to cisgender girls. It gives other teams the right to challenge somebody's sex. It has they want to have some board to do inspections to make sure who's a woman and who's not. I mean, these things are bizarre and to me unconscionable. And also, I would point out that the number of transgender athletes in the United States, I mean, you can count them on my hands and toes, and yet we have this national uproar. And why do we have a national uproar? I mean, I think it's because the right wing in this country sees it as an issue that can divide women. And because some very much, from the best possible place respond to this idea of fairness and feel like there is an unfair advantage for trans girls and they want to see a playing field that's level. What I would say to them is that what we need to understand is that these issues about trans athletes in sports, particularly trans girls, it never just stops with sports. It's usually part of a much broader agenda, which is very, very harmful for all trans people, and pretty much is, I think, aimed at eliminating them from public life in a way that's incredibly cruel. But they're finding it successful as a demagogue issue. It's a successful issue for getting votes. And I think we have to instead have a much cooler-headed discussion about how to do inclusion in a way where nobody feels cheated and people feel fair. And unfortunately, because it's tied to these other political headwinds, we're not getting that.
No, what you're talking about is that it's very much part of the organizing principle of culture war, and it extends to banning books on LGBTQ people.
Yeah.
I mean, it goes on and on and on. For example, the Princeton University women's sport team talked about the fact that if you ignore the biological advantages that transgender athletes can have, you're really doing a disservice to the fight for women's equality in sports. How do you react to what's going on with this?
Well, I think it's important to be inclusive. I think that there was 27 states and rising of places that have completely banned transgender girls from participating in any sports. And I think that they're going through so much that I think we have to be a little more inclusive. And there was a transgender woman who won the NCAA swim meet, which is what's prompted all the discussion currently. And Dave's right, such a small number, less than 1%. I mean, it's very small. I think we have to protect women's rights, but I think we also have to be open to being inclusive.
I'm going to go into the audience, but Jerry, do you have a comment on this whole issue of transgender?
Well, I thought when it started to emerge that we weren't ready for it. And then now that it's here, we really aren't ready for it. I mean, it's an incredibly complicated issue that requires a lot of high concept thinking. And when you put that with the culture wars that we're going with right now. It seems like cruelty instead of resolution has become the intent here.
Hi. I want to just ask about the issue of equality and the challenge we have with women athletes getting paid the same or being respected the same when we're so driven by the economics of sport and ticket sales. And a fraction of the audiences watch women's sports or attend women's sports as do men's sports. So how do we ever reconcile this challenge when at the end of the day, ticket sales are such a driver and the economics are such a driver of the sports industry?
And that was what was so interesting about the soccer, because the women had better attendance. They sold more gear. They made a lot of money. 90,000 people in LA watched a women's soccer game and 40 million on TV. And they still weren't paid equally. And in my view, why are we talking about having them paid equally? They should be making more. They're better. So it should be a meritocracy. And
Okay, go ahead. Don't be afraid to applaud. Go ahead.
And I think in the WNBA, you mentioned the infusion of capital. Kathy Engelbert, the commissioner of the WNBA, former first female president of Deloitte, she's making a lot of changes, and we do need to have that sort of infusion of capital. I think the problem is we get 4% of media attention. People don't know about the WNBA. They don't know about women's sports, and I think they need to do a better job marketing in every sport. I mean, you turn on SportsCenter, you're not going to see women's sports on there. And I think until that improves, it's a little bit of chicken and egg. I think that we will be able to make some money, and I think we are proving that we are profitable. You look at the NCAA, we are profitable. They haven't tried to sell the corporate advertising to all of these sponsors that have come in for both men and women. They haven't made them do anything. Now you're starting to see that's going to change, and I think eventually women will even make money in the NCAA tournament.
Okay. Anybody have questions on this side? Anybody at all on this side? Let me ask you a question then. Transgender. Does anybody have a problem with inclusion, competition at all?
I just have a comment about that. If you look back to the tennis world, when Richard Raskin became Renee Richards, he was noted as saying that, in fact, he was at a disadvantage because he was a large 6'2", let's say, man who had been taking female hormones and was now propelling a male skeleton with a female musculature. So, not so easy.
I have nothing to say to that. Okay, what did you say, Jerry?
Like I said, we're not ready. We're not ready for. I mean, there are so many things that we have to wrap our minds around. We have been taught throughout life that you are either biologically 100% male or you are biologically 100% female. That is absolutely not true. And so there's this ton of gray area that we need to try to define, and it's incredibly, incredibly complicated. And everyone, I tell you one thing that's not going to solve it. Everyone who just sort of like picks one side and rigidly stands on one side. We have to get to a point where we can have big level, advanced conversations and compassionate conversations.
Well, that's partially why we're here today. And I'm going to turn to Brandy. I don't want to put you on the spot, but if somebody was watching this and saying, absolutely not, we should not allow transgenders to compete, how could you help that person maybe hear this a little bit differently? It's a tough question, but.
Yeah, it's very tough. And I agree with Jerry. It is so layered. It's not that easy. I believe everybody has a place on the field or on the court or in the pool. We're not all going to be physically equal, and we have to find ways within sport as an athlete to use our greatest strengths to either push ourselves and propel ourselves to championship levels, or as teams manipulate the situation so that we can have benefit. And so I welcome everybody to the field because, you know, I might be left-footed or I might be right-handed, and maybe that's a disadvantage in some areas, but in other areas it's an advantage. So, you know, I have to just be myself and do my best and compete as hard as I can. And at the end of the day, that's what I can go home and, you know, I could lay my head down very comfortably with.
Okay. I see you nodding. I'm not going to put you on the spot, but what you're thinking? What are you thinking as you listen to this?
So what I'm thinking is that I hear the younger generation now not want to define, well, I hear them speaking of gender fluidity. And I ask all the time, what does that mean to you? So for me, that's what I'm thinking of is, I think you're right. It doesn't seem like it's quite the time because maybe we need to speak to our, let's say, prepubescent and young adolescents about what does it mean to have or experience gender fluidity.
You have two young sons. Are you, I mean, is this something that resonates with you in terms of discussing with your own children these are really complicated issues?
Yes, it resonates with me, and I don't know exactly how I'm going to broach that conversation with them at this point.
Right.
But it's an issue, and it's something that none of us in this room grew up thinking was gonna. We didn't grow up thinking this was on the horizon, but it's here now, and we have to deal with it. And it's not just about tolerating it; it's about accepting and embracing and finding a way within sports for everything to fit together.
Dave, you mentioned some of the heroes, some of the activist heroes at the top of the show, Tommy Smith and John Carlos, and well, I mentioned Muhammad Ali, Bill Russell, Martina, Billie Jean. Those folks were dealing in a different era where you weren't living in as much of a divided country as we clearly are now, where we weren't driven by hyper-partisanship. Talk about, or is there no difference at all that you can stand up now? You say more athletes are taking that platform, that they really, that they are out there. Is there no difference at all?
Well, you know, Mark Twain said history doesn't always repeat itself, but it does rhyme. So there are strong similarities with the past that we need to take into account. But there are also some real differences now. And the one strong similarity that I see is that you don't see athletes speak out unless there's a movement on the ground, unless there's a movement in the streets, unless there's a change in cultural consciousness, which sports then reflects and amplifies. So people who might say things like, well, where are all the athletes? Where are they speaking out on X issue? You first have to ask yourself, where are the people speaking out on this issue? And why would we ask of athletes what we don't ask of ourselves? And I think that's one of our problems these days when it comes to politics and sports. And it's definitely something that I wrestle with, is that I think we feel so disempowered as a society that change will come through Congress. And we're so not used to asking people in power to really address the glaring social and cultural issues that plague this country, that we find ourselves turning to entertainers, turning to athletes, turning to people in the culture to try to make these changes because we can't see them realistically being made through a political process. So that's a lot of pressure to put on an athlete. I mean, imagine you're 23 years old, you know, you've been going through the paces to become a pro athlete, and that's been your focus your entire life. And all of a sudden you're expected to have something to say about Chinese labor and its role in the American economic chain. I mean, that's a big ask. And it's a lot of pressure. But one of the functions of social media is that now they have the access to be able to speak what they think, even if either they're not ready to have an opinion on it, or to take the parlance of what Jerry said, we're not ready to hear what they have to say.
All right, Brandy, I saw you nodding about this. I mean, is this, go ahead.
I have a smile on my face because to Dave's point, you know, one day I was a team member of the U.S. women's national team, and then the next day I scored a goal, and now all of a sudden my opinion really mattered, more so than it ever had. And it is a great weight to carry and a responsibility. You know, it does cause tremendous pause, I feel. You know, speaking, I think, you know, in a knee-jerk reaction way has been dangerous, and there's been a lot of lessons learned in those moments. But I think too, you know, why are we asking of athletes? I think it's because it's a big platform, or entertainers. It's a big platform. They have the ability to be heard by so many. And I've heard Charles Barkley say, I'm not a role model. I didn't sign up for that, but I feel like there is some kind of responsibility we do have as putting ourselves in these positions of great awareness, that we can make change and we can help the conversation move in a positive direction. Like, for example, we talk about the marketing dollars that are being spent in sports, and why aren't we selling more tickets on the women's side? And this has been the age-old debate with U.S. soccer until now. We've come to this new settlement, which is, if a sponsor came to U.S. soccer and says, we want to sponsor U.S. soccer, they would say, thank you very much for the money. And then 85% would be spent on the men's and boys' side. And if a sponsor came to U.S. soccer and said, we want to sponsor women's soccer, they would say, no, 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 you cannot. You are sponsoring all of soccer, and we will decide where the money is spent. Until Visa came to U.S. soccer and said, we want to sponsor U.S. soccer. And U.S. soccer said, okay, thank you. And they said, but the caveat is it must be spent equally. And U.S. soccer balked, and Visa said, fine, we'll go away. And they said, oh, hold on. Okay, we'll do it. And so when companies like Visa show up and make a stand, that also has great impact.
Muffet, you now teach, is it leadership, for lack of just a...
Sports leadership.
Sports leadership at Notre Dame. And going into this whole notion of, is this part of your syllabus to talk about what's appropriate in terms of taking a platform or taking a stand?
I think it is important, and I think it's incumbent upon all athletes, because they do have that platform, to make sure that people know what you think. And I think Dave's exactly right. When something happens nationally and people protesting, we had the biggest protest ever when George Floyd was killed. So it was a little bit easier, I think. But the people that didn't speak, I think they were the ones where people would point to and say, do you want to play for that coach? She doesn't care about racial equality. Do you want to play for that coach that's not speaking out? So I think that they can use it either way.
At this point, I want to talk a little bit about what you see happening in the future, what there might be in terms of flashpoints for equity. Jerry, what do you see potentially looking ahead that could happen?
Wow, I mean, I think you have to look at this entire, people call it the athlete empowerment era, and the influence, not just politically, but within the sports of themselves, and of athletes really standing up for themselves, really understanding that their voices and their sentiments matter. Right. I think that's going to fundamentally change sports. It's already changing sports. I mean, we can talk about college and name, image, and likeness, and the freedom of movement from the transport portal. We can talk about the way star athletes in certain sports, the NBA in particular, are kind of essentially working as de facto GMs to get their teams to make the decisions that they want to make. All of that is kind of changing the dynamic of how you lead this new generation of athletes. And I don't think they're going to be silent. I think that you are going to see in future generations more and more athletes step into their power. The question becomes, now, how do you create structure around all that freedom, and structure that is not exploitative, and structure that is healthy for both the people at the top of the organization trying to lead, but then the athletes trying to get everything that they deserve.
Dave, I want to ask you about the NCAA in terms of, the door was open last year with a Supreme Court verdict that talked about some compensation. I think Justice Kavanaugh said that only in America would the business model, which is loaded with antitrust violations, be allowed to happen. What do you think? Because isn't there another potential verdict coming up?
Look, I would much rather hear what the coach has to say about this than I would. But I really would. So it's almost like I want to, God gave me 2 ears and 1 mouth, and I think I better do the math and hear what coach has to say. But since you asked me the question,
yes,
I will just come in and say that I think that it goes to your question to Jerry. I think this question of how the NCAA evolves and how it deals with the issue of compensation is going to be one of the political flashpoints, and it's going to intensify in the years to come because the money, particularly for football, is only going to increase because football is one of the few things that people will watch TV commercials and sit through them to watch. It's
Right.
In our day of cutting the cord. So it's like, so because of that, the money is going to increase to the point that it's going to just create more basic pressure on anything resembling the student athlete model. And the thing that I always go to in my head is I think about Clemson football and the fact that the coach now of Clemson football, famous guy, Dabo Swinney, he makes a 8-figure salary. And the coach of Clemson in 1981, when they won the national championship, was a guy named Danny Ford. I looked up his salary; it was $50,000. So how does a job that pays you $50,000 a year, which
Right.
ain't bad for 1980s money, but still,
Right.
how does a job that paid you $50,000 a year become a job that pays you $10 million a year? Well, if that happens, it has to necessitate, I think, volcanic changes in the worker management sense, as opposed to just looking at it strictly as a student coach question. But like I said, whatever the coach says, I agree with.
All right. And Brandy, again, I see you nodding in agreement, I think, with Dave. What are you thinking?
Well, my husband coaches at Santa Clara University women's soccer, and so the idea of just as a whole, whether it's women's sports, men's sports, basketball, baseball, football, soccer, cross country, when the students start to have this power and earning power and NIL, and now all of a sudden they could be making nearly as much as the coaches or more. How does the power balance equate? And I think, like Dave said, I'm really interested in Muffet's comments on this, because I think it's a really slippery slope and very precarious situation.
Muffet?
Well, I think we're in a really bad place right now. College athletics is heading in the wrong direction, in my opinion. I think that coaches' salaries are completely out of control. That's marketplace, and that's how things are going. But that is one problem. But the NIL, I think, is a really serious problem. We're not going to be amateur athletes anymore. I think it's going to take away from everything. I saw yesterday, Ohio State said we need $13 million just to keep our football program and get these kids that we want. And honestly, I thought that seemed low, from what Dabo Swinney's doing and what Nick Saban's doing. So I think we're in a really bad place right now for athletics. And the NCAA had an opportunity to fix this 7 or 8 years ago. They knew it was on the horizon. They did absolutely nothing.
Jerry?
So when there's a void in leadership, corruption often fills that void. And there's a lot of bad ideas. Name, image, and likeness, which if you go through and you look at the Alston Supreme Court case, which continued the opening of the floodgates of this. The NCAA was policing, and athletes like Ohio State quarterback Terrell Pryor, you're suspended because you signed your autograph and got money for it, or gave away your shoes. That they were starting to police those kinds of things, or you even go back further than that, like. There's video games with your likeness, but you can't make any money off of that,
Right.
And the money is all. So there was a lot of ineptitude in kind of seeing the future there. You had a chance to be more fair, to regulate, to reform, and instead you let the courts and the lawmakers decide. And once the courts and the lawmakers get involved, you're in trouble, and that's where college sports is right now. It's just absolute chaos.
Is there something, let's talk about, we're going into the last part of this broadcast, and I always try to have silver linings as people, we're looking for something hopeful here. And I happen to know that Dave speaks pretty eloquently about the whole notion that the generation of 15 to 25-year-olds have suffered what you call, Dave, generational trauma. And yet, the silver lining is that they are clearly more tolerant, they're more apt to protest, they're more predisposed to activism. Talk about that whole generation and what your feeling is.
Look, I mean, I don't know if I'm an optimist at heart. I may very well be a pessimist. Maybe it's pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will, or something like that. But I do know that when I wrote my book, The Kaepernick Effect, it was at the very start of the pandemic, and I got to speak to several hundred young athletes who took a knee. And we did it all by the phone. We were all, in lockdown in our places of residency, and I just developed these relationships over the phone where they were telling me these stories about the after effects of them taking a knee. And I started the book feeling incredibly pessimistic about our world. I mean, the pandemic was happening, the elections were not exactly filling me with hope. And then after talking to these young folks, it was such a reminder to me that politics is not just about what the people with the bad haircuts do on Capitol Hill. Politics is about how ordinary people choose to live their lives and the moral choices that they make. And talking to these young people, I was so struck by their morality and their sense of civic responsibility as athletes. I mean, I don't know about people there, but when I was growing up, we didn't exactly look to the athletes as the place to show us the moral way forward on campus. Such a thought would have been even like a subject of high humor. It's like, oh, no goodness, there's apartheid in South Africa. What does the football team have to say about it? That never would have come up. But this new generation has taken that and turned it on its head. And I think in a lot of ways, they've responded to a vacuum that exists in our society, because I spoke earlier about there being a political vacuum of people feeling like they have no faith in political solutions to our problems. But there's also a vacuum in terms of just basic places where human beings gather and talk to one another. I mean, we're so atomized from one another. And sports is really not just entertainment, but in a lot of small towns and cities, it's the last place of community gathering. And so they have stepped in, these young athletes, way too young to have to shoulder this, but they have stepped into this vacuum and chosen to express the ailments of the world without fear. And that's why I truly feel that this young generation, which is more demographically diverse and less tolerant of intolerance than any generation in the history of the United States, will not settle for what other generations have chosen to settle for, and will actually deliver us to a better world.
Eloquently was the right word. Muffet, you're up here nodding in agreement. Is this what you're seeing among your students and among the younger people?
Absolutely. This generation is going to change the world. And you know what? This is the first generation that grew up on social media. So maybe that's the difference. They have a platform, but you look what they're doing with gun control and some of the ways they're stepping up and speaking their mind. And they're able to do that because of the social media platforms.
I want to ask you, because you didn't mention that you coached Kathy Engelbert when you were a coach at Lehigh and she was at Lehigh. So are we thinking that maybe someday you could maybe be the NCAA commissioner?
Well, I think they need a woman for sure.
Really? Can we lobby for you? Can we do something for you? No?
No, thanks. That is a job no one wants right now, I think, being in charge of the NCAA, and I'm included in that.
What would you do? What would you do? You have ideas. What would you do if you got in there as head of the NCAA?
Well, I think when you look at what happened 2 years ago in the NCAA tournament with the incredible disparity in the men's and women's tournament, I mean, it was just so obviously unequal. And they've let that go on for years and years because that's the culture at the NCAA, that they don't value women. The sponsorship, they don't ask them to activate on the women's side, even though they've put in to activate. Buick did a fantastic job this year with their commercials. Capital One mentioned women more. So we're getting more attention. But I think if they had somebody in charge who actually saw the value in women's sports, I think we'd be in a lot better place.
And that would be you. Just saying, I don't know. We're partial. I don't know. You might have some folks who would help you with that. Brandy, we've gotten through this broadcast. I have not asked you what you were thinking at the moment that you ripped off the jersey. And that moment for you, I know, was, I can't even imagine, seminal. It was just, in some ways, that's all people know about you. And yet, if you had to write your legacy, if you had to have people remember you in a certain way, what would that be?
Oh my.
It's a good question.
Yeah, it's a really great question. One that I think has a lot of layers to it. But I would hope that they would say that I was a true steward of the game. I appreciated the opponent, and I had respect for the process of development and earning a spot on the team. Maybe you don't know, but leading up to that moment and that penalty kick, I had been a world champion and then cut from the team, not in the next World Cup, and then made my way back to the national team in 1996 for that wonderful 1996 summer of the women's athlete in Atlanta, playing a totally different position, that I only learned for 4 or so months before. And then I was put in a position to score a goal that, even though I was a striker in my earlier days, that I became a defender. So for me, I think it's about the process and, how we can find true grit and determination and resolve within ourselves, how we have to give up some of our control to give to propel others up. That moment was about relief and joy and a little bit of insanity, obviously, in that moment of 90,000 plus people. But it means so much in so many different ways to any one individual. I have so many people come to me and say, here's where I was, this is what I was feeling, this is what I see it being now. And it changes over time.
And for the young women you're coaching right now, is that what you're telling them?
I'm telling them to bring their best selves, to speak up for themselves, to be bold and be brave and make mistakes, and don't fear, and put the success in front of the process, and to enjoy every single bump, and to be optimistic, as Dave was talking about, even though I think everybody around is more fearful of what could potentially go wrong. I say embrace that, and move forward. And you won't always make the team, and you won't always start in the game, and that's okay. That's really, truly, I think, when I look at this moment, and that's what I see.
What was that? I missed it. What did she do? Do it again.
Oh.
What did she do? Oh my gosh. Oh, a bobblehead? Oh my God.
Yeah,
doesn't get
needs
better than a
bobblehead.
bobblehead.
You need one, Jane.
Oh yeah.
You need a bobblehead.
Okay. I only want one if I can get Muffet shoes. Jerry, I did mention you have two boys, Miles and Austin. And are they players? Are they sports players? Are they?
I think they like video games more than sports, but I'm working on them.
Oh, really?
Yes.
What do you want their sport to be?
I would prefer that it was basketball, but I think track and field might be their thing. Well, the youngest, absolutely, he loves tennis. So I think he's going to play tennis.
And if you're looking at the landscape with that rich history of activism we've been talking about today, going forward, we already know Dave maybe is not a crazy optimist, but how are you feeling about the future of politics and sports and the whole subject we've been talking about?
Well, the future of politics don't feel so good. The future of sports, fantastic. No, but I mean, for me, I think there are some lessons from sports that I wish that all of society would take. And I have an acronym for you. It's CAR.
Oh, no, not another acronym. Really? Go ahead.
It's confrontation. Healthy confrontation is a huge part of sports. And I think athletes, coaches, so on and so forth, they face issues head on. You've never seen a team win a championship that wasn't honest with each other. The A, accountability. We need a higher level of accountability in this country, person to person, but also in the people that we appoint in leadership. And then the last thing, critical to sports, revision. I always talk about Let's go watch the film. Let's go back and let's correct. There are so many things in society that for hundreds of years, we keep doing the exact same thing and not learning our lessons. These are things that every day in sports, healthy confrontation, accountability, and revision. Those are lessons that you have to take from the world of athletics.
Who knew? Thank you. That was really wonderful. Because it is about all the things you just talked about. It's about trying to get along with other people. It's about humanity. It's about conflict resolution. It's about all those things. And as David and everybody else has said, it's about the young people. So thank you very much for being with us today. And we're grateful to all of you for donating your time and your talent, and to our studio audience and to you at home. We thank you for joining us. Originally from the other Washington, Connecticut, now in Litchfield, Connecticut. Until we see you back here next time for Common Ground, I'm Jane Whitney. Take care.